The moment Donald Trump realized that Israel could no longer dictate the pace of war in the Middle East, the entire strategic balance of the region began to collapse. And make no mistake about what I'm about to tell you here, because this is not just another temporary crisis between Iran and Israel. This is the beginning of a geopolitical transformation that could permanently destroy the old American-led order in the Middle East. What we are witnessing right now is something Washington never believed possible. Israel is losing deterrence. The United States is running out of leverage, and Iran has emerged from this conflict stronger, more disciplined, and far more dangerous than anyone in the White House is willing to admit publicly. And if you think that sounds dramatic, stay with me, because what's happening behind closed doors is even worse than the headlines suggest. The first thing people need to understand is that Netanyahu walked Donald Trump directly into a strategic trap. This war was sold to Trump as a fast operation. They told him Iran would fold under pressure. They told him American military superiority would force Tehran into submission within days. They told him Israel could dominate escalation. But none of that happened. In fact, the exact opposite happened. Iran absorbed the initial assault, reorganized its command structure almost immediately, restored operational capability faster than American intelligence predicted, and then demonstrated something that terrified Pentagon planners: strategic endurance. Iran proved it could survive sustained pressure while simultaneously threatening the economic arteries of the global economy. And once that realization hit Washington, panic quietly began spreading through the administration. Now publicly, the White House continues pretending everything is under control. They talk about progress. They talk about framework agreements. They talk about diplomatic opportunities. But behind all the public relations language is one brutal reality. The United States no longer has a clean military option against Iran. The Pentagon understands this. CENTCOM understands this. The intelligence community understands this. The only people pretending otherwise are politicians and television propagandists who still think war is a Hollywood movie where American power automatically guarantees victory. It doesn't. And this war exposed that illusion in the most humiliating way possible. What's fascinating is how rapidly the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu has deteriorated behind the scenes. Publicly, both men still try to maintain appearances because they need each other politically. But privately, the frustration is enormous. Trump feels Netanyahu manipulated him into a conflict that offered no clear victory path. Netanyahu, meanwhile, is furious that Trump is now searching for exits instead of escalation. This is why you're hearing mixed messaging every single day. One moment, Washington talks about peace negotiations. The next moment, Israeli officials threaten more military action. Then American senators suddenly demand finishing the job. This confusion is not strategy. It is evidence of a coalition beginning to fracture under pressure. And here's where the situation becomes truly dangerous. Iran understands all of this perfectly. The Iranian leadership now believes time is on their side. That is the critical shift. Before this war, Iran feared direct confrontation with the United States because it believed American escalation dominance remained intact. That fear is gone now. Tehran watched the United States burn through ammunition stockpiles at alarming rates. They watched American logistics strain under sustained operations. They watched Washington quietly delay weapons shipments to allies because inventories were running low. And they concluded something profoundly important. America's ability to sustain prolonged high-intensity conflict is far weaker than advertised. If you thought that was alarming, it gets worse. Because this conflict has also exposed massive weaknesses inside the NATO alliance itself. European governments are increasingly uncomfortable with serving as launch platforms for wars they do not support politically. Populations across Europe are turning sharply against unconditional support for Israel. Younger generations in the West view this entire conflict completely differently than older Cold War-era political elites do. That generational divide matters enormously because political systems eventually reflect demographic realities. And Israel's leadership appears completely incapable of understanding this shift. What Netanyahu and his coalition continue doing is operating under assumptions from the 1990s and early 2000s, when American global dominance was virtually uncontested and Western public opinion could still be shaped through fear-based narratives. That world no longer exists. The rise of alternative media, independent analysis, and global information flows has fundamentally weakened centralized narrative control. People now see destruction in real time. They see civilian suffering in real time. They see contradictions in official statements instantly. And this has created a legitimacy crisis for both Israel and the United States internationally. But the military dimension is even more serious. Let's talk honestly about what Iran accomplished strategically. Iran demonstrated it could threaten the Strait of Hormuz without formally closing it. That distinction matters. Tehran doesn't need to physically block maritime traffic permanently to create economic chaos. It only needs to create uncertainty. Oil markets function psychologically as much as materially. The mere possibility of disruption changes pricing structures globally. Insurance rates spike, shipping risks increase, energy markets panic, and suddenly every country dependent on Gulf energy begins reassessing its relationship with Washington. That is exactly what's happening now throughout the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, they all understand the regional balance is changing. Publicly, they may still maintain partnerships with Washington, but privately they are recalculating. Why? Because they no longer fully trust American protection guarantees. And once allies stop believing in your ability to protect them, the foundation of your regional order begins collapsing. This is why China is watching this crisis very carefully. Beijing understands that America's Middle Eastern credibility is eroding in real time. And unlike Washington, China is playing a patient, strategic game. The Chinese are not interested in dramatic military adventures. They are interested in long-term influence, economic dependency, and political stability favorable to Chinese interests. Every time the United States destabilizes a region without achieving decisive results, China gains relative strategic advantage automatically. And if you stay with me here, because this next part is critical, you'll understand why Washington's problems are actually much bigger than Israel or Iran alone. The real issue is that America's entire post-Cold War model depended on uncontested military supremacy combined with financial dominance. But both pillars are now under strain simultaneously. Militarily, the United States faces adversaries capable of absorbing punishment while inflicting economic costs globally. Financially, countries are increasingly searching for alternatives to dependency on Western-controlled systems. These trends reinforce each other. Every failed intervention accelerates de-dollarization discussions. Every sanctions campaign pushes nations toward alternative economic arrangements. Every strategic failure weakens confidence in American leadership. Iran understands this dynamic extremely well. That's why Tehran no longer negotiates from weakness. Iranian negotiators now approach discussions believing they survived the maximum pressure phase already. From their perspective, they endured sanctions, sabotage, assassination campaigns, cyber warfare, proxy conflicts, and direct military confrontation, and they are still standing. That changes national psychology profoundly. Now here's the part Western audiences are rarely told. Iran also learned from every previous American war. They studied Iraq. They studied Libya. They studied Syria. They studied Afghanistan. They concluded that centralized command structures are vulnerable, that economic resilience matters more than technological glamour, and that political endurance ultimately defeats military overextension. So Iran decentralized authority. They prepared succession structures. They diversified production capabilities. They expanded drone manufacturing. They hardened infrastructure. In short, they prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. Meanwhile, what did the United States do? It spent decades believing technological superiority alone guaranteed victory. That mindset created arrogance, and arrogance is fatal in strategic planning. American policymakers consistently underestimated opponents because they assumed adversaries would psychologically collapse under pressure. But countries fighting for perceived national survival often endure far more punishment than outside powers anticipate. This is why Pentagon officials are deeply concerned right now, even if politicians refuse admitting it publicly. They know Iran's missile capabilities remain largely intact. They know Iranian drone production recovered rapidly. They know escalation risks remain enormous. And most importantly, they know another major military campaign could fail catastrophically. Imagine the consequences if American forces launched another massive operation and failed to neutralize Iran decisively. The geopolitical shockwaves would be historic. Allies would panic. Adversaries would become bolder. Global markets would convulse. And the myth of unstoppable American power would suffer irreversible damage. That is the nightmare scenario keeping strategists awake in Washington tonight. And yet Netanyahu continues pushing for escalation because politically he has no exit strategy left. His entire leadership identity became tied to confrontation with Iran. Walking away now looks like defeat. But continuing escalation risks national exhaustion. Israel is already facing severe military strain. Reservists are exhausted. Economic pressure is mounting. International isolation is growing. Social divisions inside Israel are intensifying dramatically. And despite all the rhetoric, Hezbollah remains operational in Lebanon. That front is especially important because it shattered another Israeli assumption. Israel believed overwhelming force would quickly neutralize Hezbollah infrastructure. Instead, Hezbollah adapted effectively and imposed real operational costs. Israeli military planners now face the reality that prolonged multi-front warfare could become unsustainable over time. But what truly terrifies Israeli leadership is demographic and political isolation internationally. Support for Israel among younger populations across the West is collapsing at astonishing speed. In the United States, this shift is especially significant because American political support historically formed the backbone of Israeli strategic security. Once that foundation weakens, everything changes. And here's the terrifying part nobody wants discussing openly. Israel has never truly developed a sustainable long-term regional integration strategy. Its security model depended heavily on overwhelming military superiority backed by unconditional American support. But military superiority alone cannot permanently stabilize hostile geopolitical environments. Eventually, political accommodation becomes necessary. History proves this repeatedly. Yet Israeli leadership still behaves as though unlimited force can substitute for diplomacy indefinitely. It cannot. No state in history has maintained permanent strategic dominance through military coercion alone without eventually facing severe backlash, overextension, or collapse. And if you think this situation cannot become more unstable, stay with me, because the nuclear issue changes everything. Before this conflict, Iran officially maintained nuclear latency without openly weaponizing. That ambiguity provided strategic flexibility. But wars change calculations. Once leadership concludes conventional deterrence may be insufficient against external aggression, pressure for nuclear capability intensifies internally. This is basic strategic logic. States pursue deterrence when they feel existentially threatened. Now, publicly, Iranian officials still avoid openly declaring weaponization intent. But inside Iran's security establishment, the debate has unquestionably shifted. Many now argue that only nuclear deterrence can permanently prevent future attacks. And whether people like hearing that or not is irrelevant. Strategic behavior follows perceived survival requirements, not Western preferences. The tragedy is that this war may ultimately trigger the very proliferation outcome Washington claimed it wanted preventing. Because once one regional power openly moves toward nuclear capability, others follow. Saudi Arabia would respond. Turkey would reconsider options. Egypt would reassess strategy. Suddenly, the entire Middle East enters a nuclear competition phase, and that would represent one of the greatest strategic failures in modern American foreign policy history. But perhaps the clearest sign that the old order is collapsing comes from the behavior of America's traditional allies. Increasingly, they are hedging. Germany is hedging. Japan is hedging. Gulf monarchies are hedging. Even smaller NATO members are reassessing dependence on Washington. Why? Because they see unpredictability replacing stability in American strategy. And unpredictability destroys alliance confidence faster than weakness itself. The reality is simple. The world is moving toward a far more fragmented power structure, not a clean multipolar system, not a stable bipolar order, something messier, something more dangerous. Regional powers are asserting themselves. Old institutions are weakening. New alignments are forming. And nobody fully controls the transition process anymore. That's why this crisis matters so much beyond Israel and Iran. It represents a stress test for the entire post-Cold War international system. And right now, that system is failing the test badly. But what happens next may be even more shocking than what has already happened. What happens next depends on one question that nobody in Washington can answer honestly anymore. What exactly is the end game? Because when you strip away all the speeches, all the media narratives, all the political theater, the United States and Israel are now trapped inside a strategic situation where every available option carries catastrophic consequences. Escalation risks a regional disaster. De-escalation looks like surrender. Endless stalemate destroys credibility, and meanwhile the rest of the world is adjusting to this new reality much faster than Western leaders understand. This is why the current diplomatic activity should not be misunderstood as confidence. It is desperation. The sudden interest in negotiations, mediation efforts through Qatar, indirect channels through Pakistan, backdoor communications with Gulf states, all of this reflects a leadership class searching frantically for an exit that doesn't look like defeat. But there's the problem. Iran already believes the United States has lost strategic momentum. And once an adversary believes that, negotiations fundamentally change. Iran is no longer negotiating as a country trying to avoid war. Iran is negotiating as a country that believes it survived the war and emerged stronger afterward. That psychological transformation changes everything. Because nations that think they survived maximum pressure become far harder to intimidate later. And this is exactly why Trump's political position has become so dangerous domestically. Remember, Trump built his entire political identity around the promise that he would end endless wars, restore American strength, and stop wasting American resources in foreign conflicts that produced no clear victories. Instead, what happened? He inherited strategic instability and then walked directly into another Middle Eastern confrontation with no realistic path to decisive success. His supporters are beginning to notice the contradiction. Now, publicly, Republican establishment figures still support aggressive rhetoric because many of them remain deeply tied to the old interventionist model. But inside Trump's broader political coalition, frustration is growing rapidly. The America First base never wanted another prolonged Middle Eastern entanglement. They never wanted another open-ended regional crisis draining resources while domestic problems intensified at home. And the longer this situation drags on, the more politically toxic it becomes. But if you think that domestic political pressure is severe, the military reality is even worse. Because behind closed doors, military planners understand something deeply uncomfortable. The United States is no longer structured for prolonged industrial-scale conflict against resilient regional powers. That's the lesson Ukraine exposed. That's the lesson the Red Sea crisis exposed. And that's the lesson Iran reinforced brutally. Modern warfare consumes ammunition, logistics, maintenance capability, industrial production, and political endurance at rates Western governments had forgotten existed. For decades, the United States operated under assumptions built during the unipolar era. The idea was simple. America could project overwhelming force anywhere on Earth faster than adversaries could respond effectively. But that model depended on several conditions remaining true simultaneously: uncontested logistics, secure maritime routes, industrial superiority, alliance cohesion, and psychological dominance. Those conditions no longer exist the way they once did. Iran understood this transition long before Washington admitted it. That's why Tehran focused heavily on asymmetric capability development instead of trying matching American conventional power directly. Drones, missile saturation, proxy coordination, maritime disruption capability, decentralized command structures. These are tools designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses of a larger military empire dependent on expensive projection systems. And what shocked American planners most was not merely that Iran resisted pressure. It was that Iran demonstrated strategic patience under pressure. That distinction matters enormously. Countries panic when they believe survival is impossible. Iran did not panic. Iran adapted. And if you thought adaptation alone was alarming, the economic dimension makes the situation even more explosive. Because every major war in the modern world ultimately becomes an economic war. And right now, the global economy is entering an extremely dangerous phase. Energy markets remain unstable. Inflationary pressure remains significant across Western economies. Supply chains remain vulnerable. Debt levels are unsustainable. And now, geopolitical instability in the Persian Gulf threatens the single most important energy transit corridor on Earth. This is why Gulf monarchies are quietly recalculating their relationships with Washington. Contrary to what many people assume, Gulf leaders are extremely pragmatic. They do not make decisions based primarily on ideology. They make decisions based on survival. And survival means adapting to changing power balances. If they conclude Iran now possesses escalation leverage that the United States cannot reliably neutralize, they will adjust accordingly whether Washington likes it or not. This explains the increasingly cautious language coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Publicly, they still support regional stability. Publicly, they still cooperate with Washington. But privately, they are already preparing for a future where American military dominance in the Gulf is no longer absolute. That future would have sounded impossible 20 years ago. Today it looks increasingly plausible. And this is where China enters the equation in a way most Western audiences still underestimate. China does not need to fight the United States militarily to weaken American influence globally. It only needs America to overextend itself strategically while Beijing presents itself as a stable economic alternative. That's exactly what is happening. Every American military crisis pushes countries closer toward diversified partnerships. Every sanctions regime accelerates discussions about non-dollar settlement systems. Every failed intervention weakens faith in the Western-led international order. The Chinese understand something many American policymakers still refuse accepting. Influence in the 21st century depends as much on reliability as raw power. Countries follow stable systems. They avoid chaotic systems. And right now, Washington increasingly appears chaotic. Look at the contrast carefully. China offers infrastructure, trade, manufacturing integration, and long-term planning. The United States increasingly offers sanctions, military escalation, political unpredictability, and unstable coalition management. Which model do developing countries think appears more sustainable over time? That doesn't mean China will dominate the world uncontested, but it does mean the strategic environment is shifting fundamentally away from the assumptions that shaped American foreign policy after the Cold War. And nowhere is that shift more visible than inside NATO itself. One of the most important but least discussed consequences of this conflict is the growing discomfort inside Europe regarding America's use of alliance infrastructure for wars Europeans neither support politically nor benefit from economically. European populations increasingly see themselves paying the economic price for geopolitical agendas they did not choose. Energy crises, refugee flows, inflation, industrial decline. These pressures accumulate politically over time. This is why anti-establishment movements are gaining strength across Europe. Citizens are beginning to question whether alignment with American geopolitical priorities actually serves European national interests anymore. And once that debate enters mainstream politics, alliance cohesion weakens rapidly. Remember this carefully because it's critical to understanding where the world is heading. Alliances survive when interests align naturally. They weaken when relationships become dependency structures, maintained primarily through inertia and fear. Right now, inertia is fading. Fear is changing direction, and interests are diverging. But perhaps the biggest strategic shock of all has been the collapse of deterrence mythology surrounding Israel itself. For decades, Israel cultivated an image of near-invulnerable military superiority. That image formed the psychological foundation of Israeli regional deterrence. But prolonged conflict changes perceptions. Once adversaries observe that Israeli society experiences exhaustion, internal division, economic pressure, and operational strain like any other country, deterrence weakens. This does not mean Israel is weak militarily. It remains extremely powerful. But power and invulnerability are not the same thing. And once opponents stop believing you are untouchable, they become far more willing to absorb risks. That's exactly what Hezbollah demonstrated. That's exactly what Iran demonstrated. And this is why Israeli leadership now faces a terrifying strategic dilemma. Escalation no longer guarantees intimidation, but restraint risks signaling vulnerability. This is one of the most dangerous positions any state can enter because it increases the temptation for overreaction. And if you thought the regional implications were severe already, consider what happens if nuclear ambiguity disappears entirely. Because here is the reality nobody wants discussing publicly. The Middle East is approaching a strategic threshold moment. Once enough regional powers conclude conventional security guarantees are unreliable, pressure for independent deterrent capability intensifies automatically. Saudi Arabia has already signaled repeatedly it would not remain passive if Iran moved toward weaponization. Turkey possesses technological and industrial potential. Egypt would face immense pressure to reconsider strategic positioning. Now imagine a Middle East where multiple major regional powers either possess nuclear capability or maintain rapid breakout capacity. The entire strategic environment changes permanently. Crisis management becomes exponentially more dangerous. Miscalculation risks multiply. Proxy conflicts become harder controlling, and global powers lose much of their traditional leverage. Ironically, the policies designed to prevent proliferation may end up accelerating it. That is the historic tragedy unfolding here. But perhaps the most important transformation is psychological rather than military. Around the world, countries are beginning to internalize a new reality. The United States can still project immense force, but it cannot always impose political outcomes. That distinction changes international behavior profoundly. For decades, many countries aligned with Washington because they believed American dominance represented the permanent structure of world politics. But permanence was always an illusion. History never stops moving. Power always redistributes eventually. Empires always face limits sooner or later. The only real question is whether leadership recognizes those limits intelligently or collides with them catastrophically. Right now, Washington appears dangerously close to collision, and what makes the situation even more unstable is that nobody fully understands what replaces the old order. This is not a clean transition. There is no agreed architecture emerging. Institutions are weakening faster than new mechanisms are forming. The United Nations lacks credibility. International law increasingly appears selective and politicized. Regional organizations remain fragmented. Great powers distrust each other deeply. Economic systems are fragmenting into competing blocs.